Platemark is a podcast about prints and the printmaking ecosystem. In every episode of Series 3, we'll hear from people who occupy various roles in that ecosystem, and that includes artists, of course, but also printers and gallerists, curators, art historians, and a bunch of other people. I'm your host, Ann Schaefer. I work to promote prints and printmaking through this podcast, through organizing fine art print fairs, and also organizing exhibitions. The goal of the pod is to demystify the world of prints and printmaking, which can be technically challenging, and to demonstrate the range of opportunities to work in this charming corner of the art world. This is a show that takes you behind the scenes to expose the generous, collaborative, and creative people working to better the world one print at a time. Today's guest is Yayoi Shionoiri. She is the in-house counsel at Powerhouse Arts, which was the host of the Brooklyn Fine Art Print Fair last year, and which we are working toward again. I wanted to talk to her because as an arts lawyer, she has information in her head about all kinds of things like AI and also copyright. So we get into it. I hope it's useful. Let's see, housekeeping. I identify as a cishet white woman and I use the pronouns she, her. I record Platemark in Baltimore, Maryland, the land of the Piscataway Conoy people. There are no images for this one, but if you are curious, you can head over to platemarkpodcast.com and check out the show notes there. All right, let's get rolling. Yayoi, it's great to see you. Thank you for coming on Platemark today.
Hi, Anne. It is so wonderful to get to see you after a little bit of time where we worked so intently together, which I hope to talk about today.
It is nice to see you as well. Yeah, so we worked together on the Brooklyn Fine Art Print Fair, and as soon as you came on board, which was, I think, October, I was like, oh, she's a lawyer. I got to talk to her on the pod. So here we are. Yes, I have lots of questions for you, and we may have to go into a second part at some point because my Facebook Platemark group has a lot of questions too.
That all sounds wonderful, and I'm so honored to be on Platemark. I realized, I think, going through your archive on your website, I think there's over 6 pages worth of people who have been on your seminal podcast. So I'm super, super honored, but I don't know if there's an art lawyer who has already been on the podcast.
You know, to tell you the truth, you are the first art lawyer that I have ever had the pleasure to know well enough to ask on the pod.
I'm deeply delighted.
Yeah. Can you introduce yourself, everybody?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everybody. My name is Yayoi, she, her pronouns, and I do call myself an art lawyer, although I always then have to asterisk it because often people are like, what does an art lawyer actually do? So I practice law at the intersection of fine art practice, mainly in support of artists and their creative expression. And that means allowing for artists and art and cultural workers and art entities the scaffolding to let them do their thing. And when I mean scaffolding, it's about things like setting people on rails, helping people understand the bounds of the law as it affects their artistic practice, and still to try to allow people to be as creative as possible. I've been a lawyer now for over 2 decades. Which to me seems like a very long time. And it has been a huge hustle to remain an art lawyer over that period of time, supporting artists directly, working at museums, working at art and tech startups, and currently at Powerhouse Arts, which is where, Anne, you and I got to work together on our project.
Is art law like an actual thing you can walk out of law school with, or is it you have to cobble it together like the history of prints and printmaking?
Yeah, no, that's such a good question. I think when I was in law school, it was definitely already a field, but it was still burgeoning. And it was relatively difficult to understand as a law school student what an art lawyer actually does. whether that's working for a for-profit entity or a not-for-profit entity, being on the commercial side of the art world or not, supporting artists directly in-house or working with a number of artists or a number of institutions, that path to becoming an art lawyer was actually very unclear. And I would say in the last 20 years that I've hustled to be and stay an art lawyer, in fact, I think that path or series of paths to becoming and staying an art lawyer has become a little bit more codified, meaning now more and more people who go to law school are like, oh, I'm interested in the field of art law, and I can think about the types of jobs that might exist for me if I say I want to be an art lawyer. However, at the end of the day, art law is really sort of an amalgamation of different bodies of law as it affects artistic and cultural practice. So it's really sort of a cobbled together grouping of laws. And obviously, the more intimate knowledge one has of art history, art markets, and systems, the better it positions, I think, somebody to become an art lawyer.
Oh my God. It sounds so complicated.
But as does yours, right? Like you wear many hats. You are a curator, you're an art historian, you are a podcast host. You also are somebody who is big in the printmaking community. I mean, all those things require different sorts of skill sets and knowledge base sets too.
Sure. Yeah, no, that is true. Yeah, we never really had a chance to sit down and have a cup of coffee together. So you may or may not know that I left the Baltimore Museum when our new director cleaned house and swam without a direction for several years until the pandemic, which lit the fire under my patootie and, finally got my poop in a group, and here we are. So it's, it is the same kind of, how am I going to remain relevant and do good things for good people, and we're actually pretty similar in that manner.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing that. It is always sort of a question of, I do feel very lucky and honored that I get to call what I love as part of my job, right? So I don't really think of my job as a job per se. In this weird way, I think of it as in some ways a calling. But the question then becomes, how does one consider one's career development and career path, especially if it is related towards something that one is so passionate about?
Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah. I'm not sure I knew what I was passionate about, except that I wanted to be in a museum. Like that was really all I knew, and everything fell into place after that. Yeah, it works. It all works out. All right.
Did you ever, I guess, can I ask you this? Did you ever feel, were there things that were surprising about your position in a museum once you got there? I assume that's a leading question, because I assume the answer probably is yes, but I don't know. I mean, if it was your dream, if little Anne's dream was to become a museum person when little Anne became bigger Anne, what did that look like for you?
I think I didn't. It wasn't until I was in college, and I've talked about this in other episodes. I did a semester abroad, quote unquote, in New York City. I went to school in Ohio. And for that, you had to organize your own internship. And I somehow, I don't know how, got an internship with Barbara Haskell at the Whitney. and I wasn't, I don't think I knew museums were my thing quite yet. Like I just knew it sounded cool. And day two, sitting in her office, I was like, this is it. And that was the end. It was just so, she was working, we were working on an exhibition of Ralston Crawford at that point. And, I was sort of like the third in line research assistant sort of person, checking facts and stuff. And, it was just like, you work hard towards this goal. It goes up on the wall with a beautiful book. It's just like, this is awesome. This is it. Just hit. That was it. Yeah. But I don't know if things surprised me. I would say the things that surprised me were, depending on which museum you were in, everything was so different. How many resources one place had versus another completely affected what you did day to day. And, the difference between being at the National Gallery and then the Baltimore Museum was night and day, Sure. But I learned a lot at the National Gallery, and at the Baltimore Museum, I was sort of, let free to fly. And because there are only two of us in the department versus, 25 at the National Gallery.
Yeah.
And so we got to do a little bit of everything. So it was just, it was the right move for me at that point. So.
And that is very similar, right? I mean, it's true actually also for people who want to be in-house at museums also. It's more rare that a museum has an in-house lawyer or a group of in-house lawyers that support the curators and the programmatic team and the operational and facilities teams. Just because one says one is a museum lawyer doesn't mean that one museum lawyer does similar things to other museum lawyers. It's very much dependent upon the structures of those institutions too.
Right. Yeah, there was a team, a general counsel's office at the National Gallery, but not at the BMA. I think we turned to a couple of trustees whenever we needed some advice, and that was about it.
Right.
Yeah.
And, there's no right or wrong model, although I would like to advocate for more lawyers because I believe in sort of the field in and of itself. But I also am cognizant that museums and other nonprofits and culturals definitely have a budget, and they have to think about how best to deploy their funding too.
Right. Sure. All right. So we're here to talk about you.
Yes.
And, I always talk about or ask about people's paths and how in the world they got to where they got in the end. And you are my first lawyer on the show. So I want to know, how in the world does little Yayoi decide to go to Harvard and become a lawyer?
Yeah. So I am an art historian actually first by training. And in some ways, I sort of fell into that. I was a humanities person, but ironically, as a first-year student in undergrad, everyone is expected to take what is called an expository writing class, and one doesn't have any choice as to the topic of the class. One can sort of apply to certain things, but there's no guarantee that one would get into the class of one's choice. And I did not get into the class of my choice, but instead I got placed into museum ethnography studies expository writing class. And so that was really one of the first times that I realized as a very, very young person that museums are social constructs. They are created by humans with particular biases. I mean, that's sort of obvious now. Now I think most of us realize that, and we talk about that as sort of this very obvious place that museums are created with bias and with social constructs. But that, as a young person, that was really the first time I had a chance to really think about that, learn somewhat of the theory behind museum ethnography, and then write about it. And that was really also one of the first times that I realized that in a humanities writing course, it's possible to write about things that are of interest to a person. And I think that sort of opened me up very immediately to the idea, maybe I should actually study art history. Maybe I should try to, because I really loved it. I just never really had a chance to think about it in that sort of a way. However, at that time I also knew that I would be coming out of university with a lot of debt. And as an immigrant person, I was a little bit concerned that I would not necessarily, if I had come out with an art history degree, I wasn't sure what sort of careers lay ahead of me. And in some ways, I took a very conservative approach there. And I said, so while I took a lot of art history classes on the side as my electives, I continued down my path of being a political science person, particularly sort of studying at the intersection of US and Japan, as Japanese is my first language. And I thought, well, that could potentially be this interesting career opportunity. But of course, this sort of pull of art history remained so very strong for me. And so in some ways, I was grappling with the fact that I was like, what should I do when I grow up? Do I try to do a career that seems like a possible viable career versus this other thing, which is of my large intellectual interest, but fear that I wouldn't be able to do anything with it?
Sound like everybody's parents.
And like at the end of the day, I had a lot of discussions with my family, with my mom and dad about this. And then I made what I thought would be a safer choice, where I said to myself, well, if I go to grad school, either law school or business school, and then come out with what I think are applicable professional skills, maybe that will make me more marketable in the art world. Little Yayoi thought at that time. And now, had I known how difficult it was going to actually be to become an art lawyer, I'm not so sure. Like, I think older Yayoi would, if I had a moment to like time travel back to littler Yayoi, I think I would have said, hey, this is going to be really hard. It's going to bring you a lot of joy, but a lot of uncertainty too. And so I'm not so sure if I would have recommended this path. But at that point, here I was. So I get myself to law school saying, well, so I didn't go to business school. I decided to go to law school. And I said, hey, I'm going to come out with some professional skills and I want to try to apply them to the art world. And fast forward, it just took me a very, very, very long time to get to the art world. In fact, so I first practiced on Wall Street for many years. I did M&A and corporate securities work. And then right before the financial crash of 2008, when I was still a Wall Street lawyer and things were starting to get a little bit sort of strange out there, I said, well, maybe this is the last moment at which I can leave the law firm environment. And so I was looking through a Japanese community newspaper, those free papers that are often available at ethnic grocery stores. And so they're always sort of, they used to be piled high in the Japanese supermarkets at the entrance. And so I was looking through, and it's still paper back then, right? It's not an online bulletin board or anything. It's fully this paper newspaper, and there's classifieds in the back. And there's one ad that says, Long Island City, Queens, Japanese artist looks for translator. And it almost was like emanating a halo around it, and it was popping out at me. And I kind of had a sense of who that might be. Somebody who had a big enough studio in Queens who needed a translation staff.
Wait, how did you know?
How did I know?
Yeah.
There's really only maybe I would say like less than 5 people, 5 Japanese artists who were based in Long Island City, Queens, New York at that time, who had a big enough studio that necessitated, I think, translation, right? And then I ended up sort of interviewing, and that was Japanese contemporary artist Takashi Murakami. And that was really when I first got a wonderful opportunity to work directly with an artist, figuring out really how the law can advocate on behalf of artists.
Wow. Was he in New York at that point?
He spent a lot of time all over the place.
Yeah.
He was very, very busy. Yes.
Oh, wow. 300 people? That's amazing to me.
Yes. And so I learned a lot. I mean, I'm so grateful. That was also the time where I got to learn how small businesses operate. How important it is to keep project management going, like how to communicate between team members and departments that might have differing perspectives or different priorities. I mean, right, all sorts of things that have continued to serve me well as I sort of be out in the world and think about projects as well.
Wow, it's amazing. It never occurred to me to try and work for It's so funny. I was so single-minded about it. I wanted to be in a major museum. And, I got back to the Whitney after that internship and worked there before grad school. And I was just like hell-bent on it. Like I'm not going to work for some commercial gallery. I'm not going to work for some auction house.
Yeah, it was always the museum environment for you.
Yeah.
And why was it so important for you that it was a big museum? Because it had structure to it, or you felt like it would allow you to do more, or?
I think that really on the very flimsy surface level, I thought it was cooler.
Oh, it is cool. I agree. I mean, I am I'm the first to admit this about myself. Like, I am a deeply institutional person with all of its pluses and minuses. But for me, I guess, like, I don't necessarily necessitate or equate institutions with big structures, because I think like small structures can also be institutions unto themselves too, right? So for me, I don't think it's too important for me to be in a very, very big place, although I fully understand the coolness factor. But I will say I actually enjoy working through the challenges of working with people and working together with people to do projects. Yeah. I really do.
Yeah. I found that I also love to collaborate, which is probably why I love printmaking. And I love, working towards a single goal or whatever. But I always found the sort of management structure to be so frustrating. And we, never made enough money. And I couldn't have done it if I didn't have a partner who supported my love of my job, like, oh. So
well, on behalf of the printmaking community, I would like to thank this person and thank the people in your life who have allowed you to be UN. I do agree. I mean, this is maybe sort of a tangent in another discussion, but I am fully cognizant that in the United States and in other jurisdictions too, it is very hard to be an arts worker and to stay and flourish as an arts worker.
Yeah. Yeah. Which, when you start talking about the kind of original formulation of museums and the structure and everything. It was no wonder they were all run by the volunteer ladies who lunch, kind of a dealio, and the ideas and everything came out straight out of that and the philanthropic collector, let's share knowledge thing.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's no wonder that we're sitting in this mire of restructuring how we think about it all.
Yes. And of course, that reckoning, whether it's self-reckoning or external, all of that obviously is very important, for sure. And I definitely grapple thinking about like what is the role of a museum in 2025 in the United States? Like what is that? What is it supposed to serve as? What is it supposed to symbolize? And who is it symbolizing for? Again, I think those are complicated questions, and I just certainly hope that there will be still time to discuss those things, and that museums will still be given the leeway and the breathing room needed to figure that stuff out.
Whenever we started, I can't even remember when we started talking about all this stuff, maybe 2005, 2010, somewhere in there, like the reckoning. But I always kept circling back to the collection. Like, what are we supposed to do with the collection?
Yes.
I mean, repatriation for some things, for sure. But I always felt not smug, but a little safe in the print department because there was more than one of everything. Yeah, you were a little outside of that issue, pretty much.
Well, that might be an interesting segue to think about printing standards too. I mean, you are obviously such the expert sort of in the printmaking field, amongst many others, of course, right? And like I would say, like I'm more of a printmaking enthusiast. I love seeing prints being made. I love supporting artists who experiment with printmaking. But for me, like, and this kind of goes a little bit towards the standards in our industry as well as the legal standards too, that I think, edition printing standards, both from like a industry community standard as well as legal standard, I think is so much more fleshed out than fabrication standards. And I've always been very, very curious about that, right? So again, I am not a print nerd. I'm just adjacent, right? I have worked in-house with artists who have multidisciplinary practices and have worked with prints. And I've also seen like artists work with printing houses or printers. Like, for example, Nancy Rubens working with Jake Samuel, who's an etching master who recently, I think, closed up their shop. I've also seen the Chris Burden estate through working with Gemini out on the West Coast, right? So I've seen these like wonderful iterations of these relationships flower between artists and artist estates on the one hand with their printing presses and their print masters of their choice. It is actually wonderful to know that I think there are community standards as well as legal standards that set forth the working relationship between artists and printmakers. And I've always been curious about why that has developed and why that hasn't yet developed in other arenas of the art world.
Right. With prints and printmaking, if you go back in time, way back to the 16th century, somebody like Rembrandt would have, well, sometimes he printed himself too, but they would print on demand,
Yes.
They would sell and they would print 5, so they had them when they went on their trip or whatever. And so this idea of the limited edition that's very codified and kept track of didn't really happen until the 19th century. And it was, people like Whistler and those guys that realized that there was a new burgeoning collecting market for prints. And they came up with this plan to rarefy the multiple by numbering it and adding in, the outside of commerce proofs with maybe remarks or on blue paper. And it was all to feed this market of people who wanted to collect the special version of that same image, right? So it all seems to go back to this moment in the 19th century, I think primarily in France with the peintre gravure, which was this moment when artists, I think they realized that they could print for themselves at home, took their own agency, and stopped working with the print shop, which was run kind of like a guild, Like that was always what you did. You brought your plate, you said, please print this for me, or your drawing even, please make this plate. Idea of an artist kind of separating out from the commerce part of that print shop led to this idea of the collectability, and it was like this pot of stuff, the stew that came together. And all of that limited edition stuff holds today. I mean, I don't think there's I don't think it's written down anywhere. It's sort of an understood across the board thing, although people break it all the time. You know, if I do a new colorway, can I keep printing this? I'm like, sure, yes, as long as you keep track and make sure everyone knows what you're doing, you know. But it's fascinating when people have issues with it. Like somebody in our Facebook group was, I was asking them what they wanted me to ask you. And they were like, well, so what happens if I'm, I'm an estate person and the person, well, he's not dead yet. He's in dementia, but he was finishing this plate and he didn't sign these. And can I sign them? I'm like, oh God.
Oh, no, yeah, that's very juicy. And it seems like it's a very real hypothetical for that person.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I guess there's multiple ways to sort of think about that question, of course. And I guess from an art historical perspective, and I would love to hear your views too, right? Like, I think at the end of the day, when an artist is state leader, I guess as that person is thinking that they're becoming an artist estate leader because the artist that they work for or they help support or they represent is getting older in years, the first question is their artist intent? Is their artist intent to finish the edition? And, given that hypothetical, it seems that person, that artist may not be able to currently give that artist's intent. But is there something in the past when they were more lucid, perhaps, where there's notes left or emails or faxes or anything like that, or even communication with the printing press about finishing or not finishing? I think that forensics, is, for me at least, it's very important. And then if there is not that, and if the artist estate person decides to go forward with finishing the print, then it becomes, I think, a question of transparency, right? Like what sorts of disclosures and they're not always even required and codified in the law, but I think what is required from a community standard or an art historical standard, I think is just important to say, this edition was finished by the artist estate. And maybe you were also talking about, the hypothetical seems to be talking about signing, which I think is a different kind of thing that we should talk about for sure. But like, for me, then it becomes a question of transparency. And then, of course, I think if it is an artist estate finished edition, I would then also imagine that the estate finished editions will probably have a different kind of pricing in the market too, I would think. And I actually think that's probably correct. Because at the end of the day, I think a collector is going to want to know to what degree the artist's hand, artist's labor, artist's thinking was involved in creating and finishing the edition.
Yeah, for sure. I think I circled around too, and maybe it's because this is what I've found as a cataloging person in the museum collection. What you find, or what I found to be most transparent and helpful, was an estate stamp on the back that said, the state finished this, blah, 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 blah. And if there is a signature, that it's, you can make a stamp out of the signature as long as it's very clear that it's a stamp, right? And then everyone knows that this is the posthumous strike from, Pollock from 1967, that they redid all those plates, blah, blah. Yeah. So I'm okay with it as long as I agree with you. Transparency, for sure.
Transparency is everything. And I think that also goes towards, the relationship between printing presses and printmakers and the artists too, right? Again, coming back to why I think your community is so wonderful in this way. There's all sorts of ways, obviously, to cut the relationship between printmakers and artists. But I have seen, and this is sort of, you tell me because you're an expert, I'm only adjacent, right? But it seems, at least from the outside, that it is a little bit more collaborative, and there's a little bit more discussion between the artist and the printmaker as the work is done, right? For example, so there's like an edition that is set beforehand. And then sometimes the edition is split between the artist and then with the printing press to sell, right? Then there are printers' proofs and artists' proofs, right? There is a way, and there's also, I think it's much more that in the printmaking world, that the printmaker or the printing press gets credit, like open credit, that they are responsible for working on that collaborative piece, either through the fact that it's listed on their website for sale or there's a printing shop or what have you. And I've always thought that that was very interesting. And in comparison to the fabricating relationship, the relationship with fabricators and artists, I think is not as clear. And perhaps that's not true. I was going to say it was because it's unique, but that's not true because I think foundries create editioned bronze sculptures, for example, with artists too. But even then, I guess I would say there's something a little bit more veiled when it comes to the fabricator relationship with artists. I've always been very curious about that. And as somebody who works at Powerhouse, which is a fabrication facility where I see wonderful creative expression and R&D and collaboration happen between artists who come in and bring their ideas, and our fabricators help to actualize that work and make that work happen, make art happen. I'm hoping that eventually down the line, maybe there's a little bit more clarity in the fabrication world also, to let fabricators also be able to say, we had a hand in this, and to be included in that crediting. And some artists, I would say, are very good about that. They say, hey, I created this work in collaboration with blah, blah, blah foundry or blah, blah, blah fabricator, or it's included in the credits of people who worked on the work. But I would not say that that is the norm. And I've always been very heartened to know that, at least from my perspective, it seems that collaboration is a little bit made more transparent in the printmaking world.
I think that is true. I've told people this before on the pod, that at the museum, if we had prints in an exhibition and they were amongst all of the other things, that we wouldn't list out who the publisher was and who the printers were, because it was thought that in a sort of general arts exhibition, that would be too much information for the public. They wouldn't understand what it meant, blah, blah. Mm. But if it was a print show, we would list everything, which I thought was fair, but also kind of not so. I, of course, would rather give credit to everybody. But if the relationships are veiled for the consumer, for the viewer, it gets complicated really fast. But I think in the States, the print shops that started the revolution, the print revolution in the 60s, Crown Point Press, Gemini GEL, Universal Limited Art Editions, all of them, they got all of these really big famous painters in to make prints for the first it was kind of a first thing. I mean, the whole thing was just like this incredible blossoming of stuff, right? That those artists, Rauschenberg-Johns, whoever else, kind of shone a light on all of these print studios. And therefore, it became a thing. Oh, I want to go work with Gemini in LA. And I think that was part of why it's understood that there are these, relationships that are well worth shouting about, Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I do think at the end of the day, like, I think it is important for members of the public to realize that while, the artwork is always by one artist or an artist collective, and the copyright stays with that artist or artist collective as it should be, there are other artist support experts, like fabricators and printmakers, that are often involved in helping to make that work happen. Our artists don't always operate in a vacuum, right? We started this conversation talking about Renaissance painters who had ateliers and had hundreds of people work under them and had different expertise that supported the creation of frescoes or murals or what have you. And that hasn't necessarily changed. And I would say that when I try to explain what Powerhouse is to a non-art person, or even sometimes an art person, I'm often asked very openly and transparently, what's fabrication? What does that mean? Like, what is a fabrication facility? What does a fabricator do? And I am reminded that it is important for people to realize that an artist, some artists work obviously on their own, of course, and they're solitary and they do everything from A to B. But a lot of artists, that's not necessarily the case, especially if that artist is interested in experimenting with different materialities and is interdisciplinary and creates work at a variety of scales.
I think that goes to this false hierarchy of the unique object and the genius, artist alone in his garret in Paris or whatever, that forever, as you say, there have been multiple people in a studio helping to create work, and it hasn't stopped. Like, who could keep up with Takashi's work as a solo person? You couldn't do it.
You couldn't do it.
Yeah. So that I think that is a piece of the puzzle that is not very clear to the public that's not in it, you know?
Yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about the incredible project that you and I got to work together on, if you're so willing. I
Oh,
know
gosh.
that there were many other people already involved in the Platemark community who were in fact celebrated at our print fair, but I wanted to talk about it because it was such a wonderful moment and crystallizing for me. It was just so amazing. So I would love to talk about
Oh,
it.
sure.
So, and I guess I would first want to hear from you how you felt. So for our wonderful audience, Brooklyn Fine Art Print Fair happened at Powerhouse Arts late March. We at Powerhouse would not have been able to do it without you, Anne, and Brian, our friends at Fine Art Baltimore. But it essentially was an incredible print fair where I think we invited over 40 galleries and also I think 28 or so artists, as well as art schools who are focused in print, to come exhibit over a 3.5 day period in what I hope to think is a new form or an alternative form of art fair. So I guess I would love to hear from you, Anne. How did it feel for you?
Well, the fair, I don't know if you saw me late Sunday, but I was wandering around stunned. I couldn't believe it was still full of people and people were still buying. I was like, what is happening? Because usually there's a lull. I mean, I kept describing it as I was walking out of the building to whoever was listening to me as lightning in a bottle. Like you couldn't have predicted it. You couldn't have planned it. You couldn't have, I mean, everything came together in such a beautiful way. I think we count 7,500 people in the end, which, I thought we'd hit 6,000 and be really happy. So that just seemed incredible to me. And the energy of particularly the students and all of their friends who came, this is their first fair and their first experience selling work. And this is a whole part of why this is a different kind of fair. Luther Davis, the fair was his brainchild. We agree that it's incredibly important to open the aperture on what it is to be in this whole ecosystem and to get the young people in and fully entrenched and to expose them to what this all means and how it works and to give them opportunities to connect with, people who can be their mentors. And it felt like we accomplished that plus to me. The bottom line, of course, is did all of those exhibitors sell enough to cover their costs plus? And not everybody did, but I think everybody universally agreed that it was, the shot in the arm the ecosystem really needed. I'm sure we told you 5,000 times that it was filling this void. There was a fair that shuttered right as the pandemic started that had been going for a long time, that really showcased younger, more emerging shops. And that's where Luther got his start selling with Fourth Estate. His partner, Glenn Baldrich, was there in, their early days. And with the shuttering of it, it's been 5 years, 6 years, it was a huge void because, the IFPDA, the big fair, there are barriers to entry there for many reasons. And there was nowhere else for anybody to show. So this brought that back. I mean, it's a different fair than EAB, which stands for Editions and Artists' Books. That was our goal, was to open up something that was akin to that. And I think we did it.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I think for me, having been in the contemporary art world for so long, and, I am caught in that rat race of going to fairs consistently and constantly and traveling, and your carbon footprint is horrible and your travel expenses are very high. And then you end up seeing the same kind of property from the same kinds of representatives who are always represented at these fairs globally, right? Even though it is supposed to, some fairs are supposed to actually have more of a local element to them, but not. And I think one of the reasons why is exactly what you said. It is about barriers to access to entry, both, I think, in terms of the supply part as well as the demand part also. Right? So it costs a lot of money for a lot of galleries to apply to fairs. And then once you get in, travel your works, travel your staff, and then ensure that your property tries to sell by catching as many eyeballs as possible. And then on the flip side of that, it is very expensive for people to travel to fairs and to also be able to afford the entrance fees that are sometimes charged at these fairs. And so I do think the FAF really broke that model where it wasn't just about, a pay to play system where only the people who were able to travel to show property were able to travel and do so. And only the people who were able to afford a $40 or $60 entrance fee to a fair can come in to see it, right? And so that is something for me that I'm very proud of, that I think we were able to achieve, that we are showing that a sense of discovery can be had at this level. And in fact, maybe this is the economic level at which people feel comfortable to really have a sense of discovery and to learn about new artists, learn about emerging artists, or learning about a format that they heretofore didn't really know about. And so that for me was something that I'm very proud about. And I will also add this one anecdote, and I think I might have told you also about this, but I saw an academic printmaking club, so a club represented by a school, had a wonderful booth, and they brought a lot of property and a lot of the team members, many of whom, as you pointed out, have never been on the selling side of a fair before. So for them, it was a lot of experimentation, and I'm sure it took a lot of courage to bring their property and to talk about it, and talk about it constantly to strangers, and try to get people excited about their work. But through the course of the fair, so many of the students were doing so well in terms of selling their editions, and they were getting so excited about selling through their editions that, in fact, through the course of the fair, they were raising their prices because so many of their editions were selling out. Right. But again, right, that's an interesting, not really sure if that's the right takeaway per se, but I think for them, it's giving artists a sense that they can show their work and they can try to make a living out of selling their work too. And I think that is an interesting takeaway that obviously most fairs cannot afford an artist so readily.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the other piece was the artists that we had in the loft, the self-representing artists, because there's many more artists who make their own work by themselves in their, studios at home, garage, basement, wherever, than there are who are getting published by these print shops and print publishers. So to afford, here it is again, access to a fair like that and to be able to show their work, was highly unusual. And, I haven't been flooded, but I've definitely had people say to me, how do I get in? It made for a really interesting fair in that way, because you and I are both used to the one model, the gallery/publisher, and that's it. So to have those two extra elements was just like, wow, this changes everything.
Yes. And also, I'm going to come back to this idea of community because, as you mentioned, Luther Davis is our master printer at Powerhouse Arts, and Luther and his incredible team who work on the fourth floor at Powerhouse Arts, as well as on the first floor because we have a digital print lab also. It felt like to me like Luther and his team and you, Anne, and Brian, it was like a reunion of sorts of your incredible community and the sort of combined decades of love and labor that each of you, Luther, Anne, and Brian, you all put into this community, together with your teams too. That was what I felt like I got to experience. And that felt very special because obviously it is not my community, and yet I still get to partake and celebrate in this loving, supportive, collaborative community where it literally, it felt like people were like running into each other, that they hadn't seen each other in a really long time. Some people who were ex-collaborators, some people who had like worked in similar shops together, artists who knew each other. And that, I think, also adds to this like lightning in a bottle magic, I think. And that cannot be built in a day. It can't just be built in a fair. It is actually built upon decades worth of love and community that happens to come together for these sort of a short period of time in the fair model.
What happens is that you all know each other or working away, with your artists or however you're doing it, but your opportunity to actually sit down and have a cup of coffee together is pretty rare. Yeah. And so when you see somebody else at a fair, you're just like, oh my God, that's that person. When I did the fair at the Baltimore Museum, we always had the vendor stay in one specific hotel, very close to us. And they called it print camp. Because they all go to the bar after we closed. And yeah, it was very sweet. And I just, when we do the fair here, we have a dinner for the vendors only. They come to my house, we get barbecue, take it, whatever. And some of them have never met each other, even though they've known each other's work for years and years and years. Like, we've never crossed paths. Like, oh my God, it's so nice to meet you, blah, blah. I don't want to say I'm the difference, but Luther and I and Brian, who's pretty new to the print community, by the way, he's a photographer and a photography person. We're not a company putting on a fair to make money. As a company, we give a flying, we care. And we want, all boats to rise. We want the whole ecosystem to survive, because it won't if we let things just dribble away. And so, it's heartfelt on both our parts, Luther and me.
Mm-hmm. Now, why do you think, besides the fact that you all are incredible, warm people, like, and maybe it's a self-selecting group of people that decide to be in the printmaking community, that I'm not really sure. I don't know. Do you think there's anything else about the printmaking community that makes you all so much nicer? And not just insulated too. Like, you're not like an insulating, like, you don't like marginalize other people. You're actually very welcoming. Like, why do you think that is?
Well, the most obvious thing is that printmaking in general is collaborative. You usually need somebody to help you with the equipment or some technical piece of it. The technical barriers are pretty substantial, both for viewers who don't quite understand how it's made, and also for artists, to get access to giant presses and lithographic stones and all that stuff. So I think that's kind of the basis of it, even though there are, of course, people working in their own studios. Printmaking has always been the underdog. Second only maybe to ceramics.
No comment on that one, maybe. Let's take a pass on that.
Well, I think it's because the multiplicity makes people think that it's not original, which is, of course, stupid. And it's another false hierarchy.
It's a false hierarchy.
Completely.
Yes.
And it also has this long-lasting finger in commercialism. Like, prints started as a way to disseminate information, right? Like, it's always been commercial. And the idea of artists creating original ideas and stuff that wasn't connected to a job assignment, has always been kind of parallel, but there's always this little finger sitting in commercialism. So it's always a bit of a fight, honestly. Mm-hmm. And as I said just 5 seconds ago, for viewers, understanding the technical parts is always difficult. If I can get you over the speed bump, I gotcha. Mm-hmm. But until then, you're like, I don't understand. There's 50 of them. Why do I want that? Well, the benefit of having 50 of them is that you have one, I have one. We can talk about the work. It's kind of a wonderful thing once you give up that hierarchical idea of unique work being preeminent.
I think this is very interesting too, because I think one of the interesting things that I think is going to be a quandary for me just to think about is like the printing presses and printmakers that work with a variety of artists. The more they work with artists, the more actually they will have inside in-house knowledge based on the R&D that they do for each of the artists that they get to work with. And I'm curious to think about like how that in-house institutional knowledge continues to then help or otherwise influence sort of different kinds of innovations going forward. And I wondered, I don't know, that can be both, I think, continue to be super collaborative because all boats are rised because of this collective knowledge. Or I don't know if there's at some point like some sort of a weird like proprietary thing that happens, and I hope it doesn't. But I don't know if there becomes some sort of strange competition amongst the printmakers and the printing presses.
I think there can be, but I think it's predominantly the former. People have gotten better about not codifying, but at least writing down or recording. Now that we can just record videos that are pretty simple, people have access to these tricks and tips and stuff. Before you would have to like travel somewhere and find somebody printing, and like the internet does something good in this case.
There are some good things about information dissemination over the internet.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that the sort of guild model in the Parisian lithographic shops, like I think they did have proprietary secrets that you were not allowed to know. But I think that's less and less now.
Got it.
Yeah. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, we're at sort of an interesting time in
It
the world.
is. You are right.
On many levels.
Yeah, exactly. Do you feel like we should tackle one topic? Copyright? What should we do?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk. I'm happy to talk. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. I mean, people had lots of questions when I asked them what they wanted to talk
Oh,
about.
yes.
Yeah.
Should we spend the remainder of this time as an ask me anything? I don't know if I'll be able to answer, but
Well, no.
I'm happy to answer if you have specific questions that your adoring fans in your Facebook group would like to ask. I'm all ears.
Well, I mean, people are curious about the impact of AI. That's a big one. I think people are connected to that, interested in the copyright thing. And that always seems to be shifting, depending on where you are and where you live. And I think people are confused about what their rights are and, what the kind of framework rules are. And I think it's confusing for people because doesn't seem to be a centrally located source, for the rules and regs.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for that. So not only is there no centralized source, I think the law itself and the lawmakers and law interpreters are figuring out how the currently outdated US copyright framework is meant to apply towards works that are created with the help of generative AI. And that is partially because I think the generative AI world continues to move leaps and bounds in terms of the technology, but also because at the end of the day, unfortunately, the law is always a slightly outdated thing. Right. And I would say some jurisdictions have, in fact, put out rules and regulations and guidances. And the US is starting to do that. The US Copyright Office has, in fact, put out a couple of sort of PDFs that are guidelines based upon what it thinks the rules and regs should be. But it is changing, and quite quickly as well. And the analogy that I think about often is how the US copyright rules, through precedent, identified what is copyrightable when an artist uses tools in their practice. Right. So there is a set of case law that talks about when an artist or photographer, right? And you can ask Brian about this. I'm sure he knows these cases too. Like when a photographer started taking pictures using what is called the camera, right? And whether or not a photograph had enough original artistic touch to it for it to receive copyrightability.
Wow.
Anne is shaking her head, but in fact, that is part of the history of the copyright laws as it was applied to analyzing photographs. In that realm, what ended up happening was, thankfully, it was determined that the camera is an extension of the artist's hand and that the artist can exercise a fair amount of human touch using the camera, for example, setting up the frame, setting up the subject, specifying the way in which the photographic frame would place the object, color tinting, black and white, all these things that were technological tools that kind of extended the artist's hand in producing the work. And I'm bringing this up because the copyrightability of artworks that have been created by artists using generative AI, currently, I think also there's a very interesting questioning of how much human touch is enough when they're using a generative AI tool to create an output of an artwork. And the US Copyright Office saying, what parts of these parts show enough evidence of human touch that it deserves copyrightability. And so from I think a plain English language perspective, what I think that means is that the verdict is still out, but I think the more artists are willing to experiment and to say that the generative AI tool is a tool that they're using, but then they're continuing to use the outputs that come out of those AI tools, continually editing, continually revising, adapting. The more they're able to show that, the more it's likely that a majority of the pieces that come out of the output will be considered copyrightable. But again, like that is still like the verdict is still very much out in terms of like how much touch is enough. And I mean, I would be curious to hear from your Facebook group, like if is the feelings about generative AI, is there fear, is there worry, or is there excitement And I wonder, and I guess it'll depend on the artist too, I think, in terms of how they're feeling about AI.
It seems to be falling along generational lines, no surprise. A guest that was on a couple episodes ago, Miles Calvert, who is the director of the Institute for Electronic Arts at Alfred University, said he was invited to a conference. He gave a paper about AI, and the professors in the room all were, booing him, basically. I mean, facially, maybe. And all the students were wide awake and listening,
Yes.
But
Yes.
I think what artists that I talk to are more worried about is this idea of ingesting images of their own
Yes.
work into
Yeah.
this, crazy soup of stuff and having no control.
Yes. No, thanks for that. So, in terms of the ingestion, that is true, right? And like I personally fear that in some ways some of these large language models have gotten too large because they've already ingested it, and it's hard to parse out when something's been ingested. And that is totally fair, especially someone who might be a printmaker who works with the power of images, or photographers who work with digital photography, for example, right? That they have to balance wanting to get their work out there in the world. And that's why sometimes the internet is a good thing, right? To get one's work out so people can see it and reflect on it and comment on it, and spreads awareness of the work. But then what happens when it's released out into the world, and there's a possibility then that a large language model can hoover it up, and then it's already part of this morass that's part of this like AI system. And that is 100% true. And there are some, I think, interesting experiments that artists themselves are putting out into jamming the system, that they are creating some technology that is like, for example, a jamming layer that there's a watermark that doesn't allow for the large language model to ingest it, or once it's ingested, it actually aids in the hallucination of the model. It kind of like destroys it from the inside.
Whoa.
There are some artists that are experimenting with these types of technologies, but I think those are not widespread yet. And I think those are experiments unto themselves, right? It remains to be seen what is to happen. But I want to believe, and I guess I'm not an artist, so I don't want to represent any artist's feelings. Like every artist has a right to their feelings. But I am hoping that through all of this, that some artists are able to see that there is still a possibility for artistic creativity and the artist's hand to be considered so important, especially because there are these other tools too. But I do believe AI is just another tool that is coming out that potentially helps artists be even more creative. But I get, it remains to be seen.
Sure. But I feel like it's just what happened when digital images sort of introduced themselves into people's work. And as a curator, and I think I still am, I'm a little old school, but I still want to know there's an artist's hand somewhere in there. And people will say, well, they worked really hard on the image, in Photoshop or wherever they're working. I'm like, yeah, but I don't, for you to push print on your machine feels somehow disconnected in a way that I don't care for. I'm okay with there being elements of digital. I just don't want it to be totally digital.
Totally digital.
Yeah.
And that's fair. I actually think that I would agree with that also. Yeah. Although I do also think that there are interesting digital images that are created by artists who code, and the output happens to be fully digital, but there is in fact sort of a conceptual underpinning to the reason why an artist is using the digital tool, right? I want to believe that there is originality that deserves to be protectable in that too.
Sure. No, I agree with you. If you look back at those early, the Card, Hammersley and Vera Molnar and all those guys. Yeah, no, I'm with you on that for sure. I think we just have to get used to it, and it'll be old hat when the next thing comes along.
Next thing comes along.
But it is weird to think of this thing hoovering up all of your content. Like when I look up stuff or when ChatGPT first kind of became a tool that I was poking at, like, what is this about? Its art history was terrible.
It was. I agree. It's actually gotten better.
I think you're right. Yeah. It was kind of laughable, actually. Yeah. And one of the best things about printmaking is that it's kind of like the secret club, but that's one of the worst things about it. Just evidenced by the fact that there's, 5 podcasts about prints and printmaking. That's it. Like if you look up wellness, anything, life coaching, there's 5,000 plus. And there's 5 about printmaking, and or looking at photography. Oh my God, there's so many podcasts about photography. You know, it's hilarious. So here we are in our secret corner. Happy
I would
place.
say, yeah, happy place. And I guess though I would say, like, with all respect, like, your secret club still feels very inviting and welcoming.
Oh, I hope so.
Which is not always the case for certain secret clubs in parts of the art world.
That's for sure. Yeah, I say that all the time, like we're the nicest corner of the art world. And I hope so. I mean, the technical barrier is a thing for sure. And, you know, when I was at the museum, I always thought, well, if I could just stand here in the gallery and talk to you about the work, I could get you in. It's just impossible. And the work should be able to talk for itself. But the thing that's so great about printmaking to me, well, there's a lot of things about it, but the process and the steps you have to go through to accomplish the work means that you really have to slow down. And you have to parse out the steps, and you have to think and consider, and you have to mean it, and you have to really want it. And on the other side of that coin is that if you screw it up, you can fix the plate and do it again.
Yes. Yes.
So it's you know, there's less invested in that one sheet of very expensive Arches paper that you just bought, and you know, you screwed it up with some charcoal or whatever. And then of course there's the magic of the reveal. Like we'll get you as soon as you are standing by a press and seeing what happens when you pull that print.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. I feel like we have 5,000 more topics. So when you are willing, we'll have to schedule a part 2, but I feel like.
I think this sounds good.
Yeah.
And again, it has been a deep honor to get to know you better, Anne, through BFF. And I am honored to be in community, and I look forward to so much more.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you coming on the pod so much. And I hope there are some interesting and useful nuggets for people within. So I'm sure there will be. All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this episode of Platemark with my guest, Yayoi Shionoiri. I love talking to her because, well, A, she's so smart, but B, she just has a way of thinking that I find so fascinating. And I just feel, well, as I said during the episode, I feel like we need to do a part 2 because there's certainly more questions to be asked. But I do love the idea of having an arts lawyer in my list of contacts so that I could call and say, hey, what the heck? But thanks to Yayoi for being a great guest. Thank you. And then, of course, I need to thank my team, Dan Fury of Extension Audio, for being my sound guy. Thanks, Dan. And Uncle Michael Diamond for the use of his original music. Thanks, Michael. And lastly, one to Lee Turner and Skip Barnhart for the sounds they sent me from their studios that make up the intro and outro of each episode. I think that's it. We will see you next time.